Finally, a non-long pole linear review. The Epsilon switch from Prevail Co. are the first switch that I've reviewed on this channel that use P3, which is a custom umwelt blend that was first introduced in the durock palm switches. According to Sarah on JWICK, P3 is basically an umwelt blend that includes proprietary amounts of palm, PA66 nylon, and PTFE, and it's extremely smooth. I couldn't find any data sheets on the coefficient of friction or other info, but in my testing and experience with durock palms and the QuartyPop quartz switches, they are extremely smooth. The Epsilons also come with a full nylon housing and a 68-gram progressive spring, which feels light at actuation but provides a bouncy type feel. Interestingly, I noticed in doing my comparison testing for this video that I've never tried a JWK switch with a nylon top housing, so the Epsilon checks a few boxes for me in the new and interesting department. Let's take a listen to the stock sound test right after you Epsilon that like button. Does that make sense? Right off the bat and right out of the box, these switches are smooth. I feel like they are what tangerines should have been because they're so smooth out of the box, and unlike tangerines, they sound really good. As for the sound, they are really balanced, and I personally really like the lower pitch sound signature after all the long poles I've been reviewing lately. That being said, there is a slight ticking that is audible during everyday use, so let's open up these switches to see what the factory loop situation looks like. So when Prevail said these switches were lightly factory lubed, they meant it. I found only a tiny amount of lube on the stem sliders to the point where it was basically an unlubed switch. Also important to note was that the springs had very little lube on them, so it's wild to see these JWK springs be so quiet. It's also crazy how smooth these switches are from what I'd consider basically unlubed. Let's listen to the switches after lubing with Krytox 205G0 and filming with S-Keys films, along with some other linear switches for comparison. Overall, I didn't find a huge difference in sound between stock and modded, although the stock switch had that little bit of rattle that I've come to find is very common with JWK switches. When comparing the Epsilons to the other switches in this 3-switch comparison, I noticed that the Epsilons were a lot quieter in post than the other switches. Now, I don't think that these switches are quieter in actual everyday use, and so I was trying to figure out why that might be, and I think it's because of the progressive spring. When I'm doing my 3-switch comparisons, I redo them for every video that I do. You can tell because I have I have a different desk mat for every video that I make, or I try to at least. But when I'm doing the comparisons, I try to apply the same amount of force for every switch, so that way it gets, in my mind at least, a more consistent result. But due to the kind of softer, lighter initial press of the Epsilons, but the fact that they ramp up as I'm pressing down essentially, I try to keep the beat and the speed and everything the same, but the most important thing to me is that I'm applying the same amount of force. Now, I don't know if I should be trying to get the same frequency and tone, so on another note, that's the reason why sometimes I'm pressing a lot faster and sometimes I'm going a little slower. Usually it's going to be because the slower presses have a heavier spring, but I'm applying the same amount of force. Just something that I thought I'd put out there just so you have more information about how I'm doing these sound comparisons. If you have any suggestions for me, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. This is still very much a work in progress. But back to the Epsilons. The Epsilons have a much nicer spring than the usual JWK nastiness, although there is a tiny bit of noise to them that lubing does fix, although once again it isn't totally necessary. Depending on your typing style, these switches can feel really light because they start off quickly but ramp up to 68 grams as you bottom out. But now it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly. These switches are really smooth and they sound really great, and at 55.7 cents per switch using code MAKER, they're very well priced, especially when you consider that other switches using the P3 stem, including the QWERTY Quartz and the Chaos Era Klein switch, cost a few cents more per switch. The only bad I can think of is that slight rattly noise that comes from pretty much all JWK switches, and I've already mentioned it a few times in this video, so the question becomes, how do I fix it? So I usually start with lubing the springs and then fix any that still have that noise with a little bit of lube on the leaf, and that'll generally make the problem go away. I do also feel like it's less of an issue on the Epsilons than on many other JWK switches, so if you aren't quite as sensitive as I am, you could totally use these stock. Now for the ugly. I'd love to see a version of the Epsilons with an opaque nylon housing, as I feel like that would cause an even deeper sound signature that would be really enjoyable. Maybe that's a switch we'll see in the future, but for now, the bottom line is these Epsilons are definitely worth checking out for the price, especially because I haven't seen too many long pull linears released lately that provide a great or even usable stock experience. Check out some more switch reviews here. I'm Maker Mods, and I'll catch you in the next video.